The headline is, drumroll, the value of education for export in Australia was an all-time peak at $51.5 billion in calendar year 2024. That's the headline. It's a big number.
G'day and welcome to Global Horizons. I'm your co-host, Rob Malicki, the CEO of the Global Society, coming to you today from Garigal Land in Sydney.
And I'm Dirk Mulder, CEO of the Koala News, coming to you from Durrag country, just west of Sydney.
And you know what, Dirk? We often talk about the dust having settled on major events and activities, but after the passing of the election just a couple of weeks ago now, I feel like it was less about the dust settling than it was the... Here's a bit of a graphic visualization, the blood running into the drains in the Gladiators Stadium, because there was nothing pretty about the election a couple of weeks back.
2 points. Firstly, you're absolutely right. But secondly, to be honest, who would have picked it? Going into an election weekend, I thought it was going to be a heck of a lot closer, as did a lot of people, I think. We can talk about the wash-up of it, but Adam Bandt losing his seat, there's just so much to unravel. And if you dig into it, so much that was really unexpected. So interesting times.
And actually, at the time of recording, the electorate where my parents live is up in northern Sydney, Bradfield, and they're still counting there. At time of recording, the Independent was 40 votes ahead of the Liberal challenger. And it looks like that's going to be going to recount. So it's probably still going to be a couple of weeks until we know the final result. But of course, we do know the major headline result, which is Labor returned with a thumping majority, 93 seats in the lower house. And I think importantly as well, like a much more stable Senate. There's going to be far fewer interests groups to have to negotiate with in the Senate. And overall, mate, I think that's going to mean perhaps stabler times for international ed. Or am I dreaming?
No, I think that's the hope, isn't it, Rob? I don't think anyone can actually predict that. Ironically, that's probably a good little intro. We've got Luke Sheehy coming on later in the program, so I think that's something that Luke could probably shine some light on. I dare say that he's probably a lot more conversed with the conversations that are going on around the place at the moment than what we are. So it's going to be really interesting to hear Luke's perspective. But I think the entire sector is sitting there with bated breath as to what is the direction going to be, what is the hope, and hopefully now that the election is behind us, that we can start focusing a little bit more on policy that's going to support the sector as opposed to be more election focused. So fingers crossed for that.
Yeah, instead of divisive narrative designed to divide the country. And there has already been some good news coming our way with the announcement of Julian Hill as Assistant Minister for International Education.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I really want to pick Luke's brain on this one because I think Luke would have probably known Julian for quite some time. And look, I've seen Julian speak once at a forum in Sydney, probably 18 months or so ago. Very well spoken. I think probably that the headline is that he's from the sector. So he gets us in a way that I don't think any other politician that I can remember would. He actually understands what's in the weeds. Now, at the end of the day, Julian's part of the machine. So if the government decides to take the foot off the gas a little bit, and then I think Julian's in a really strong position to assist the sector and assist government in navigating its way out into a more sustainable, productive policy agenda setting area. If Cabinet Room still says, no, we're going to put our foot down and we really want to ensure that we tighten this sector up and we bring it back to numbers that are pre-COVID and all of those policy outcome point of views or points, then, Julian's going to have a bit of a rough ride of it, as all of us will. I think the good thing is that there feels like there's a point of accountability now, that there's someone there, you can point your finger to him, you can say, he's an assistant minister, he knows what the deal is. There's no more roughshotting around the fact that, oh, really, did we not know that? What are the unintended consequences? And it takes that unintended consequence piece and kind of pushes it off the table. So those things that do happen now, there is accountability for. So I think that's a really good thing. And like I said, I think we all sit with hope and pray that hopefully we'll get some clean air and a new policy reset that will lead to more sustainable and supportive policies.
It certainly felt over the last sort of 12 to 18 months that international ed just became this football being kicked from one side to the other. And with some luck, this gives that sort of breathing space to just say, okay, let's actually go and properly consult and do the design work on some intelligent policy rather than just a knee-jerk political reactions to polls and the like. And I think that stability in government, just today there was an announcement that seems to give Labor even more breathing space. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Nationals have come out and said that they're going to tear up the coalition agreement. They're leaving the Libs. This is almost, if you had told me this before the election, I wouldn't have believed you. I think it's just too big a step. But clearly there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't know about and that will probably come to light over the next 24 hours or so. By the time this podcast airs on Friday, then I think we'll understand the decision a lot more and understand what's driving it in the background. I did see one of the National senators, I've forgotten her name, but she was speaking a little bit more about how the National Party has a decision to make around, are they supporting the Libs in city seats, or are they going to return to their roots and really look after the bush in a contemporary Australian policy manner? And it looks like they've done the latter. So yeah, it will be really fascinating. What it of course does, I think, more than anything is people were talking numerically that it would be very difficult for the coalition to get back in at the next election, just given the swing against it now. What this does is make it almost nigh on impossible for either the Liberals or the Nationals to govern anytime soon, unless there's another coalition that's going to be brought together. But you can't see the Libs anytime in the next now 2 elections being able to draw any of that back, even if somebody waved their magic wand and created a groundswell of Liberal support. Yeah, it's not looking good for, dare I say, politics, but one would have to question democracy when you've got one major party now and you've got essentially 2 minor ones that aren't working together.
It's going to be a very interesting next 3 years in that regard. It's very clear that the Liberal Party's lost the centre. They've swung way too far away from the right, and they've lost all of that middle Australia, including significant migrant communities all across the country. And you've got to wonder if this kind of anti-immigration narrative, including just pressing hard on international students and the like, hasn't it almost devastated a big chunk of that sort of aspirational base that party used to speak?
Yeah, certainly get the backup of a lot of those voters, for sure. I think if I'm reading the tea leaves right, my gut tells me that they just weren't organised. And somebody was, I think it was on Insiders, they were talking about if you were to compare football teams to politics at the moment, you've got the Labor Party, which had a pretty strong campaign management behind it. They're a football team that's got great physios and just the whole thing's put together well, to the Liberals, which are an under-16 team out the back of Whoop somewhere that are really trying to string things together and running things on a whim. And I think that's probably pretty accurate. If you think back, I said to somebody the other day, if you think about the Liberals across the country, and this is not a political statement, but if you look at the organisations of the Liberals across every state at the moment, apart from Queensland, and one would argue whether the Libs got voted in because they were that good or whether it was just that on the nose around the Olympics and the stadium and all the rest. But if you look at the organisation, you're from here in New South Wales. Remember the last local council election? The Liberal parties didn't even nominate, 3/4 of their council candidates. So there's some bigger issues, I think, within the party sitting behind just the face of cabinet ministers or people who are senior in the shadow ministry. This goes right down to the organisation of the party, and they've got big problems and they've got to have a really good look at. Unfortunately, again, across a lot of the states, there's a lot of ego in there as well, and they've got to be able to find a way to put that aside and actually start looking at themselves pretty hard in the mirror to see what they need to do to get out of this.
I tend to agree with you when you say I don't think it's necessarily good for democracy to have an opposition that's been decimated to this extent. They're going to be in such disarray for the next period of time. There's going to be no sort of contest of ideas, which is so important in a good functional democracy. So I 100% agree with that. I guess the flip side from the government's point of view is that it definitely takes the heat out of some of the more contentious policy areas. And as an international educator, what I'd like to see is that this now means there's time for them to go back and do that groundwork. They don't just have to have the knee-jerk reactions, hiking visa fees, and just a race to the policy bottom, so to speak. But we can actually get back to that methodical process of coming up with an idea, putting it out to consultation, sticking it in a committee, and coming up with a bunch of sensible recommendations that everyone can get behind. Cross the fingers, huh?
Couldn't agree more. Let's talk to Luke about that in more detail later on, I think.
A very good idea. CEO of Universities Australia. How did you get him on the podcast, mate? I'm very, very impressed at your network.
I'm not going to tell. No, you're going to make me blush. No, you know what, it's been really good. I've got to know Luke really well over the last few months, and we bump into each other at lots of things, and there's always a genuine interest at coming on, and it's been about aligning it in the diary. So it's been great to be able to get him along, and hopefully we'll have him back. Hopefully he enjoys his time, and again, in the future.
We won't ask him any tricky questions then. It'll be really nice. Tell him a dad's joke or two.
Best behaviour. Mate, let's change gears. Mate, one of the things, ironically, if I can say this, I wrote up a press release that Experience Gold Coast sent to me last week about their Careers Festival. And one of the things I've got to say, if I just stop and ponder, I've been doing this now a couple of years, I seem to get releases from Experience Gold Coast when they run events. And every single time I tend to go, that's pretty unique. or that's pretty visionary, or that's an innovation on last year. And this one was no different. It was a careers festival, but they've incorporated an after dark experience. And so I wrote it up and I put it up and I thought, yeah, that's great. And then I think I reached out to you to say, hey mate, how about recording this week? And you went, I'm getting a plane to the Gold Coast. And I thought, I wonder what he's doing there. So you were there. Tell us about it. How'd it go?
Yeah, look, it was a cracking event. So this was for Choosing Your Uni, which is my new edtech startup, AI-powered platform to help people to figure out what's the best degree and institution for them, so super personalised. And this was our first outing where we were going to get in front of a lot of people. And the Careers Festival has 8,000, 9,000 people through, from high school kids, teachers, parents, through to tradies looking to reskill, the whole gamut. And that After Dark was really nice. They literally, quite literally, Thursday around about 5 p.m, the lights just turned down and got all intimate. And they brought out all this food. There was guys playing guitar on stage and singing. It was a fantastic event. So you had a lot of exhibitors in a really nice space in the Carrara Indoor Sports Stadium. Literally thousands and thousands of students through over those couple of days. And then that After Dark session was something really unique and different. I don't know if you've been to many of the sort of careers fairs around the place, but they tend to have the same sort of feel to them.
Yeah.
And to be honest, Experience GC did an awesome job in just differentiating themselves. There was heaps of space for people to be able to move around. Often these kind of expos feel like people are on top of each other and it's crammed in and quite stressful. It was this really nice chilled vibe. People were making their way around. So I think the team up there really delivered on it. We certainly got smashed over 2 days. We were just talking and talking and talking. And to be honest, mate, this isn't a spruik by any means, but when you're starting a new business, in fact, you would have felt this at some point, right? At some point you get these signposts that come up that make you go, oh yeah, shit. Oh yeah, we're on track. I'm on track with this thing. This thing is going to do what I'm going to do.
I completely get what you're saying.
I remember when you got your 5,000 LinkedIn subscribers, and we talked about that, and you're just like, yeah, mate, it's working, it's doing it. And to us, this event was less a signpost than it was a billboard that just was saying, you guys are on the right track here. We got smashed. Heaps of students, people referring other attendees over to us, saying, oh, you got to go check out these guys. It was just an amazing event all around. So I certainly came home from that feeling as high as a kite. And then promptly, and this will resonate with you too, worked the entire weekend. That's a small business life.
Totally.
That's a small business life.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I get that. Mate, congratulations, and congratulations to Experience Gold Coast. What we should do is invite Janine Tax along and get her to maybe talk a little bit about some of the thinking behind some of the events that go on up there, because, like I said, they just seem to be able to do it well every single time.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes back to the way it's structured, right? They really have got a lot of independence. They've been really well supported over the years and been given the ability to innovate. So respect to the team up there and to the powers that be that let them be awesome.
Absolutely. Let's move along. Alan Olsen, the resident statistician at the Koala, if I can say that, he's put out I like that. I hope Alan appreciates it.
Nice.
Look, Alan obviously did the AUIDF stats for a very long time, and mate, he's such a well-mannered gentleman as well as really good at what he does. So I'm happy to spruik Alan every day of the week and twice on Sundays. But Alan's put out a new paper, and it's looking at export income from international education in 2024. Put one out a couple of weeks ago, but he wasn't quite there with the finished product. So this one finished it off. The headline is, drum roll, the value of education for export in Australia was an all-time peak at $51.5 billion in calendar year 2024. That's the headline. It's a big number. It's probably more than what we expected, but when we talk about commencements versus enrolments and all of those sorts of things, I think we'll start seeing that taper off a little bit, if not for, and again, we're talking dollar figures, right? So we're talking year on year costs going up. So the economic value per unit is expanded every year. So we've got to be really careful about comparing year to year. But again, I think we're up a little bit on last year. The interesting fact that he found through the ABS data was that it was refined and only refined a little bit, indicating that there was virtually no growth at all in the second semester. So again, going on what I just said, I think we've probably, I hate to say topped out, but we've probably topped out for the moment, given that everything that's been going on in the last 12 months. And I suspect that even with that unit increase or that increase in value per unit, we'll probably start seeing a plateauing out next year of that top line figure. Interestingly enough, education was in 2024 was the largest export for New South Wales. Was the second largest export for New South Wales, the largest for Victoria, third largest for Queensland, largest for South Australia, and the largest for ACT. We won't talk about WA because obviously the mining industry over there just bigger than Ben-Hur and overshadows every other sector massively. But this just goes to show just how important international education is to the economy, not just of Australia, but of local economies.
This is really interesting, mate. I just saw some statistics from StudyMove. Terry Ramirez and Dimitri Huckle, who've for many years been doing analysis of public domain data, and they just did an analysis of budget positions of Australian universities. And I can't remember the exact figure, but it was astronomical number of institutions were in deficit. So it's interesting to see that these national figures held up through 2024, but yet on that institutional scale, like institutions are really struggling. There's already been announcements of hundreds of job cuts across the country. So it's just interesting to see how that's playing out, and obviously isn't playing out evenly across states and across individual institutions too.
And again, a lot of this is based on forecasting, right? So what is forecast revenue? And if allocations have come in, they may not have affected this year, but if allocations are coming in, they're going to affect next year. So when you do a budget, it's literally a financial forecast. And if you're forecasting going to bring in less revenue, then something's got to give. So yeah, mate, it's interesting times. And again, this is the hard bit about being a senior leader, isn't it? It's when things go well, it's great to be able to bring on new staff and ride that wave. But when things don't go well and you start retracting, then hard decisions have got to be made and people's lives and lifestyles are affected.
Maybe let's zoom in on New South Wales being busy. New trade plan out, and happily international education is in there.
Yeah, that's right. It's one of 9 pillars which has made it into its trade plan. It goes along with housing, net zero and energy transition, local manufacturing, agri-food, defence and aerospace, digital technologies, life science and healthcare, and mining equipment, technology and services. But it's great. I guess the headline there is it's great to see New South Wales actually acknowledge that international education is one of their top pillar priorities. So it's fantastic. What it says is that New South Wales is Australia's leading destination for international education, offering world-class institutions, a vibrant multicultural society, and strong graduate outcomes. So it looks like while the federal government may have not drunk the Kool-Aid and pushed it over a little bit, certainly the states, if we think about Peter Malinauskas in South Australia, again, spruiking international education, it looks like New South Wales is coming on board in a big way. It looks like the states are waking up to the fact that our sector is really important for their economies and for their societies.
And that's a good thing, isn't it? Because if we now have an almost non-existent opposition at federal level, really what holds government to account when it comes to this policy area is going to be the states. Even if they're on the same side of politically, the states pushing back on what to now has been a very destructive set of policy positions from the federal government.
Yeah, absolutely. If we think back probably 6 to 12 months ago, we had a discussion about they're all the Labor Party. I know over in WA, they weren't getting much luck knocking on the federal door. I know Victoria knocked on the federal door and didn't get much luck. But if all of these states now are starting to bandy together and look to the federal government for more favourable policies in international education, then again, like you say, it's got to be a positive thing, particularly with the election in the background. Let's hope that groundswell of support at the state level transfers into federal policy.
Staying in New South Wales announced their annual awards are open. This is always a nice thing to see come up.
It sure is, yeah. Generally within institutions, it's orientation and graduations. Being a service provider to the sector now, this is the bit that I love. Being able to see awards come through and being able to see some of the fantastic achievements, both, and again, paraphrase this in the international awards, but you've got international student awards and you've got international, for the want of a better word, provider/service provider awards. It's always wonderful to see both sides of that fence and the fantastic work that people are doing within the sector, both, again, from a student perspective, because really our sector is all about student success, and then also those who are best practice and doing wonderful things in supporting that and enabling that. So congratulations again to Study New South Wales and the New South Wales government, and look forward to seeing the applications go in. And those who may be crowned, I think it's in early November.
You're technically New South Wales based now.
I technically am, Rob.
Somebody needs to be nominating yours truly, buddy.
Let's have a conversation after this.
I think I might just do it, mate. I'm not going to ask for your permission. I'm just going to drop it in.
That's very kind. Very kind.
Awesome.
You can't afford to miss the Australian International Education Conference happening the 14th to 17th October at the National Convention Centre in Canberra. AIE sees the place to meet over 1,500 international education delegates from Australia and overseas. Build your own learning schedule. Gain insights from sector experts, new research findings, and spark ideas at lively discussion sessions. Plus, there's plenty of networking opportunities, from the expo hall to brain dates and social events. Don't miss out. Make sure you're at AIEC 2025. Registration is open now. Learn more at aiec.idp.com.
From New South Wales, Dirk, how about we take a quick side trip down to Tasmania?
Yes.
And then maybe we can bring Luke in after that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so interesting breaking news in the last sort of 24 hours or so. Cheechas has trying to shine a light on the fact that the University of Tasmania is undergoing a process at the moment where they're considering dropping Indonesian as a language on campus. It's really interesting. You know, obviously universities go through periods where they're looking at course consolidations and going to our point around budgeting, looking at where they can save money and what they can do, what they can rationalise. Interestingly enough, it comes at a point in time where the Prime Minister has just been to Indonesia talking about our greater engagement with Indonesia, how we can work better together. Having spent so much time in Western Australia, Indonesian's a very prominent language over there. Obviously, Cheechas, the admin for Cheechas is based in Western Australia. So it's been really fascinating. In the release that Cheechas sent, it's really fascinating in that it said tertiary level Indonesian language teaching and reduce the number. It's been really interesting in the media release that Cheechas put out. It stated that the number of Australian universities offering the subject is down to 12 from 22 back in the 1990s. So when you start thinking about capacity, learning, it's a pretty alarming statistic. And if Tasmania goes as well, then it's not just there's no probably outlet majorly or in a mainstream way in Tasmania for learning Indonesian, but it's also just, I think, a larger domestic policy issue. So watch this space. There's been no determination as yet from the University of Tasmania. They've got a process to run and we'll see how it ends up. But yeah, certainly concerning for those Indonesianists and those who are supporters of Cheechas and programs such as that.
Can you imagine if US institutions stopped teaching Spanish? Mexico, biggest language group related to your country and the closest country. Imagine if they just at the same scale had cut back their Spanish language programs by 50% over a day. They'd be horrified. I'm constantly baffled how Indonesia is still so off the radar of the average Australian, and yet 110 million people sitting up on our doorstep. And a little organisation like a Cheechas just basically carrying the backpack for all of us.
No, I couldn't agree more. And again, spending the time that I did in Perth, and I shouldn't say that Western Australia has a great understanding of Indonesia. It has a great understanding of Bali, but not Indonesia. But maybe that's better than a lot of the rest of the country. At least we're aware that Bali's part of Indonesia.
And maybe that's a good little side note. I was hearing through the grapevine last week, there was a meeting of the institutional liaison officers for the New Colombo Plan, the mobility grant program. And word on the street is that program is about to get a major cut to its budget over the sort of next 18 months to 2 years, essentially taking this funding program, which has funded tens of thousands of Australian university students to have predominantly short-term experiences in the Indo-Pacific, a lot in Indonesia, so many going up to Indonesia, and essentially shifting that funding into what's an excellent program, like the long-term scholarship program, students spending up to sort of 19 months in the region, which is amazing, but just cutting off that high-volume program, that enabler of learning abroad programs of shorter duration all across the region. I was actually stunned to hear that.
Yeah, and again, we go back to, I think, the discussions that we had, probably several months ago now, after some of those discussions were released by the Department of Foreign Affairs, where there was generally a push towards the longer term study, rightly or wrongly. Having more people in country for longer obviously has greater outcomes, but the participation in getting particularly lower socioeconomic students out who, depend on jobs, who depend on all sorts of things, is now going to be much harder. So it is definitely a pendulum that swings. It's swinging much more to those who can afford to go for a longer period of time. A wait and see the outcomes for the country, but let's hope that the government knows what it's doing.
That seems like a good moment. How about we bring in our guest?
Sounds good. A big welcome to Luke Sheehy. Luke's the CEO of Universities Australia. And Luke, you've been in the job now about 15 months, I want to say, if I did my research correct. One of the questions that I've always had, and I want to kick off with, my first job out of university was actually working for the Vice-Chancellor at Western Sydney, who at the time was Derek Schroeder. And I had quite a bit to do with Universities Australia in the background. And I always thought, how do you become the CEO of Universities Australia? It just seems like a fascinating role that you could come to from probably different places, but generally having some sort of education background, probably politics background. Mate, tell us your journey. How'd you get there?
Firstly, thanks for having me. It's great to join your podcast. And what a 15 months it's been. I've been 15 years ago, 15-year feeling after 15 months. I'm exhausted. But look, it's a great gig because the universities in Australia are world-class. They do wonderful things. Education changes the life trajectory of both Australians and the 140 people, source countries of international students. And I'm delighted to be here. How did I get here? I guess I always say that higher education found me. And I started my university career studying music at the University of Melbourne in the late 90s, and I graduated realising that there wasn't a lot of jobs to be an orchestral flautist. So I worked out I had to do something else. And I found myself working at the University of Melbourne, where a lot of my friends had got jobs. And back then I thought, at least they'll teach me how to run a website. And this will be this kind of big skill that I need to operate in the early 2000s workplace, right? Websites were like a new thing. So that's one of the ambitions I had. And look, I've worked there for a decade. I found myself in international recruitment. I then kept studying like all people that universities do, did a law degree, did a Master of Public Policy. And then I was a lifelong member of the Labor Party because of my parents' background in Labor politics. So it wasn't a surprise when I found myself working for a minister in Canberra in my early 30s, which was Chris Evans in the Gillard government. So I did that for a while, a bit of tumultuous period in politics, and then spent some time back in the sector at Swinburne. In fact, today I'm in my old office where I worked 10 years ago at Swinburne. So it's feeling very nostalgic about that for the Vice-Chancellor at the time. And then the next thing I went back into politics, then ran the Australian Technology Network of Universities, and then here I am at Universities Australia. So it's been 25 years really in the sector, and a sector that has given me more than I can ever give it back. Delighted to be able to, as I said to the press club back in February, the chief evangelist for universities in Australia.
That's fantastic. I mentioned earlier you've been in there 15 months. If you were to look back on that 15 months, how would you characterise that time, and what would you say would be potentially some of your biggest surprises, but probably more given the fact that we're talking about international education, some of your biggest challenges over that period as well?
I started with huge levels of enthusiasm and optimism, which I still share this today, but for different reasons. We're all about the Universities Accord final report in February of 2024 when I started the gig, but it soon transpired that international students was going to be the dominant issue. Not to diminish the other dominant issues we've had in the sector, social cohesion, racism and the Gaza conflict and encampments being difficult issues that we've dealt with as the sector over the last 15 or so months. But international students and the deliberate political toing froing between both major parties and the sledgehammer approach to student visa processing, which we saw from the government, particularly early last year, I've described as a funeral pall over the Accord and over a whole range of other things that we've tried to do as a sector because it's so dominant. And Australia's international education sector is a great asset for this country, but we are so reliant on international education as part of our fundamental architecture of what we do at universities, particularly in terms of our funding sources. So we had to, at Universities Australia, go on the assertive and make our voice pretty loud and pretty clear that we needed a better deal and we couldn't be treated this way. So it's been a year of making our voice heard, I think, with both sides of politics, and international students was right at the centre of that voice.
Going on from that, Luke, one of the things we've heard a lot in the media over the last 12 months is this, or in particular maybe from the higher ed point of view, but around university social licence to operate and to have international students on board. And there seems to be this disconnect between the amazing work and good that it does to the country and the perception from the outside, from Joe Blow on the street corner. Any ideas on where you think the sector needs to go to get that social licence, if that makes sense?
It's a really important question that many of us are talking about and grappling with across the sector. But I'm going to come at it from this point of view, Rob. Social licence has been undermined by the attack on international education through the political system. It's not that suddenly universities have done all these bad things by having international students. For nearly 4 decades, we have been encouraged to enrol international students as part of a successful export industry for the country. I recall Liberal ministers, Labor ministers from previous governments championing our sector in international trips, on delegations to Australia, celebrations of diplomatic relations between different nations. This has been the cornerstone of Australia's soft diplomatic armory, but also economic and trade engagement with the nation and the prosperity of our country. So it did turn on a dime, so to speak, when it became a battle around a phony war, which I've described it, around housing and attributing blame on the housing crisis to international students predominantly and migration rates. When I think about social license, it's about overcoming that attack in the first instance. And then the second thing is building a really strong interest from all Australians in the health of the university sector, because the university sector delivers for Australians, irrespective if you have a university degree or not. And when it comes to that, building social license for what we do for Australia and the world, I think it's a back to basics message. We educate more than half the health workforce in the country, the nurses, the doctors, the allied health professionals. We educate all of the teachers. We educate the engineers. And we also do the research that helps us become more prosperous and more productive. That is the argument to build your social license, not just a defence to the political system. I have to overcome that defence. That's my job, representing the universities. But I think there is also reminding the Australian people of the importance of the university's core mission and core business. I've also seen this dressed up as an attack that we're too woke or that we indoctrinate our children. This came up during the election campaign. And I said, what does educating our health force, our teachers, our engineers have anything to do with being woke? So I think there is when it comes to social license, it's about investing in our reputation through telling our story about what our fundamental job is to do for the country.
What's the best way to tell that story, do you think? Dirk and I have spoken about this on the podcast so many times, the fact that what we do is so important and all of us who work in the sector understand it, but actually getting that information out. And I love the way you put it. So it's so simple. This is the core of what we do, is actually educating and upskilling the entire country. It's like the backbone of the country. But actually conveying that and getting that to resonate is really challenging, isn't it?
It's very challenging. And especially when you're in a period where there's a lot of other things happening, right? So there's conflict in the world, there's political response to that. Young people are energized, particularly about things like the conflict in Gaza, and that's materializing on our campuses. Political response to that. You're dealing with a kind of reputational deficit in some respects. And so that makes your job harder to sell the benefits and educate the country about why we're important to their prosperity. I had a chat to a number of people about this over a number of months, and someone said universities are a bit like the defence forces, right? People like to know that they're there, but they don't really care what happens as long as they're still there. That's something we have to be cognizant of. But I have thought long and hard about this. We've run a campaign to promote universities and the importance of universities to the country over the last 12 months or so. That's called Universities Matter. And that has been a series of broadcast and social media campaigning that is to all Australians. And what we've noticed from that is people really resonate with those simple but fundamental propositions about what universities do. Teaching our teachers, teaching our nurses, making our, workplaces more fair, discovering medical breakthroughs that we do with such aplomb in Australia with our medical research. So that storytelling is important. It's also important that it comes from not just universities talking at everyone else, but there are champions in our community that do that on our behalf. We also have this fantastic program called the Shaping Australia Awards, where we award universities for excellence in teaching, in research, and also community engagement. And we've had tens of thousands of Australians vote on that as the People Choice Awards. And that's a fantastic tool as well. The reality is, in Western democracies at the moment, we're seeing traditional institutions like courts, like democracy of parliaments, like education institutions, and predominantly universities in trust decline. Now, we're not as toxically unpopular as some corporations like airlines and banks and others, but
Or the Liberal Party.
Or potentially the Liberal Party. But we have a job to do in continually investing in
political statement, just watching the election result, just having a laugh. Dirk and I have just been talking about the election results, so that'll be in context for everybody.
Yeah, I'll give them their due. Giving them due. The Liberal Party and the Australian university sector have something in common. They get about 5 million votes, and we have about 5 million students who are alumni. And that was my next point. We really need to activate our alumni. Millions of Australians and millions of international students have benefited from our world-class education that we deliver at our universities. We need to activate that base on our behalf more often and more strongly as well.
While we've moved on to the topic of the election, and you mentioned earlier the attack on the social license, there's probably a theory out there that says that attack was directly linked to the election and looking at capitalising on votes, particularly in outer suburbs. We've now got a government that's come in. We've now got a new assistant minister specifically for international education in Julian Hill. And obviously Julian's no stranger to the sector, having worked in Victoria for many years, as well as being a co-chair of the Parliamentary Friends of International Education in the Federal Parliament. Now that the election's over and almost in the rear vision mirror, I just saw earlier that the Nationals have just released an announcement saying that the coalition is no more. Now that we're almost in the rear vision mirror, do you see that attack on international education, for the want of a better phrase, easing off now, or do you see that as a key policy agenda of this incoming government as well?
Overwhelming majority and landslide win for the Labor Party it gives policy clarity of what we're dealing with. This, on the surface, it's 94 seats in the House of Representatives. It's likely what the Labor Party to get. That's the same as John Howard got in 1996. It takes a long time for that to whittle away, even in one election cycle. So it is an opportunity for the sector to think about 3 and plus year horizons in our policy thinking. And so that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, and I gave a speech to this in the last couple of days to this effect, is that the election gives us some clarity around what we're dealing with. The Labor Party had a better proposition on balance compared to the Liberal Nationals. They had higher growth rates for international students, or a high allocation of numbers, I should say, to international students at universities. They didn't go as hard and fast with the visa fee rates, although they are still the world's highest. And I think there's an opportunity now for a policy reset. This is one fundamental part of what we do with our policy discussions with the government. But my message has been pretty clear for a while, is strong universities will deliver the government's agenda. It will help them deliver a future made in Australia, deliver a more productive economy, help with health, help with defence, not only just help, but be fundamental. So if you want to get that, you need to make sure we're funded properly. And so if you're going to curtail our revenues from international students, then we need to have a pretty serious conversation around where we're going to get those revenues. So the clarity we get now from a Labor clear majority is good, and we can work with them. I am absolutely thrilled that Julian Hill will be an Assistant Minister for International Education. I've known Julian for a very long time, and he's not only a strong and passionate supporter for international ed, but he knows it deeply and he understands it, and that's a great thing. And as someone who's been, like myself, I've been around international ed, both in terms of the sector and also government. The big tension you have on international student number setting is the tension between Home Affairs and the education departments. And having him in both departments is really welcome news, because he's going to be able to navigate the educational policy priorities and the migration tension. And that's something we've been missing for a long time. And so I'm looking forward to working with him. I think there's a strong recognition from Jay Sinclair and Julian Hill and Minister Andrew Giles in the skills portfolio, and of course Tony Burke in Home Affairs and Immigration, that this sector underpins so much of what universities could do, but also there's really strong community support. And we know that particularly the Indian diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, many of which came into Australia through international education, all their families have a really strong association with international students and universities, and they don't want to see them undermined or attacked. And I think there was a resounding support from those communities for the Labor Party on the 3rd of May, and I think that puts us in good stead for a pretty strong negotiation for the future of this sector with the Labor government.
Oh, I was just going to say, before we head into the last crystal ball question of asking you to reflect and put yourself 24 months down the line and predict a path for us, what's on your agenda for the next 6 months? I note that I think you've got an upcoming trip to the UK, which I think will be fascinating, particularly from an international education point of view. The UK is obviously grappling with a number of policy changes there as well. But what else is on the cards for Universities Australia?
There's this great forum where all of the vice-chancellors from every university in the country come together 4 times a year. So that's happening in Perth. I'm delighted the West Australians are hosting us at the end of May. We'll have a really strong discussion around what are our priorities. We framed our offer to the government and both sides of politics before the election in line with the Productivity Commission's priorities for the economy. Our universities are central in delivering all of those priorities: a productive economy, an economy that transitions its energy sources to net zero, a healthy economy and an inclusive economy. So we want to make sure that we're putting our offer and our collaborative offer at the centre of the priorities of the country, and that's really important. In terms of my friends across in the UK and others, I'm looking forward to going to see Vivian and Universities UK in the first week of June and talking at their conference. It's a bit like Groundhog Day, but a year behind us for them. They've got a government now that's proposing an international student fee or tax. We've had that discussion here in Australia. Hopefully it's the end of that. But certainly they're in the middle of that. A year ago, I went to go see Vivian. Very hot day in London, and we had a fake fireside chat, which seemed ridiculous because I was boiling hot. And when London's hot, it just feels like it's the surface of the sun. But what we did was had a discussion around what they could expect from a university's accord type approach to reviewing their system. And I said, well, lessons learned from us in Australia is that we let international education sit alongside and almost outside of the accord process. International education for the UK and Australia is fundamental and should be right at the centre of their thinking. And that's something that we need to keep thinking about as well in Australia. So, look, we're going to have a really busy period ahead. We've got the first minister being the same minister either side of elections since Brendan Nelson was the minister back in the Howard era. Like continuity, that certainty is going to give us, I think, a real opportunity to look at how to grow the sector in the interests of the country with international education as a fundamental part of that. It's really worth noting that Jay Sinclair, even the Prime Minister in announcing his ministry, all very supportive and strong statements supportive of the international education sector. I said in the election campaign when the Liberals sought to go harder and faster on the cuts to student numbers that we in Australia don't want to catch the Canadian disease. And what I meant by that is that we don't want to send a message to the 30 plus million international students that are looking for a global education experience right now that Australia is a place for caps and closing its sector down. So I absolutely get that the government doesn't want to go down that path and it wants to send the right signals to the market. Hopefully the UK doesn't do that. We know that when the UK does silly things, we are the beneficiaries of it. There's still got to be a bit of competition between us and the BRICS. But that's the kind of vibe I'm getting, optimistic and positive. We can navigate through the next couple of years positively together.
Dirk, hang on. Before you jump in, Dirk, I've got to ask this question, and it's sideways from the crystal ball one. You were talking, Luke, about having all the vice-chancellors together. A lot of people listening to this, maybe they've met their vice-chancellor once. If they're lucky, maybe they've met a couple at the same time. But what's it like being in the room when you literally have 30-plus leaders of institutions all around the table?
Our experience of this problem was in February of last year. I was 3 weeks into the job, so it was A, it was really daunting, and B, sticking them all in a room. It was in a horseshoe room. It looked like some sort of, with very bad lighting at the National Convention Centre in Canberra, and it looked like a mid-Soviet style party meeting. Everyone's there with their microphones and they're all spread across the room. And I'd forgotten my glasses, and I think David Lloyd turned to me and said, "Who's that down there?" I was like, "No idea," because I couldn't see that far. But it is daunting is the first thing. And the second thing is you feel completely academically inadequate. I have 4 degrees. I feel like I have about 4 not enough. But overall, what you do get when you meet vice chancellors is a passion for their institution, but also a shared interest in the success of our system. And you don't get to become a vice chancellor without having a passion and a love for education and the transformative power of university education. So it's nice to hang out with people that have the same aspirations as you. And generally, it's usually a really robust and important and valuable conversation. So I'm looking forward to it.
So one of the things that we joke about is that you mentioned David Lloyd. David Lloyd once referred to a group of vice-chancellors as an argument. Would that be accurate? Or you can pass on that. You can pass on that.
To find a lot of common purpose in the last 15 months or so from our 39 vice-chancellors, particularly on some really complex and difficult issues. And it has been a really issues-rich period for us in the sector. We counted 14 issues that we were running live briefs on that were predominantly defensive. So the arguments are there, but they're to shore up the collective response, really. So I've been really lucky the last 15 months.
That's very well diplomatically answered, Luke. Final question. We're 12 months down the line. We're looking back. What would you envisage being the main topics of conversation between now and 12 months' time?
Well, we'll probably be well into an established and legislated ATEC, Australian Tertiary Education Commission, and we will be making the case for a pretty wholesale and substantial rewrite of Australia's funding system for higher education, and that will include research. I think one of the things I'm going to be banging the drum on over the next 12 months is don't leave research out of the coal or kick it down the can. We're going to bring it into the centre of the debate around funding our institutions, and I'm looking forward to that. It's great to see Nerio Kane, Barney Glover and Larissa Barrett come back, the interim ATEC commissioners, and by 12 months' time, we'll nearly have an up and running ATEC, and we'll be seeing who's going to run the thing permanently, and that'll be another exciting moment for us.
Excellent. Luke Sheehy, thank you very much for joining us on the Koala News Global Horizons podcast. We wish you well, safe travels to the UK in June, and we wish you well over the next 12 months, and hopefully we look forward to having you back on sometime in the future.
Dirk, thanks so much for having me.
And for those of you listening along at home, of course, thekoalanews.com is your source of information for everything to do with Australian international education. I'm sure by now you are subscribed, but if not, thekoalanews.com, or once again, my favourite place for the news is on LinkedIn. I love the way that the team is always just putting out the latest articles and news on my LinkedIn feed. So great stuff, Dirk, and always good to chat, mate, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time for the next news episode.
Thanks, Rob.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the Global Horizons podcast, consider subscribing to our newsletter. Search for Global Horizons podcast and then just pop in your email address, and that way you will never miss out on all of the critical international education news that you need to stay up to date with. This episode has been produced on Garigal land in Sydney. Our video and audio editor is Len Zamora, and I'm your host, Rob Malicki. Have an awesome day. See you in the next episode.